Chapter 1. The Frosted Key. The train swayed gently as it wound through the snow-laden hills of Vermont, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels mingling with the low hum of the engine. Outside, a monochromatic world stretched endlessly, the rolling expanse of evergreens wrapped in pristine white. Amara sat alone by the window, her reflection faintly visible in the frosted glass. Her breath formed soft clouds that faded almost as quickly as they appeared, mimicking the fleeting sense of familiarity she felt with this landscape. She hadn't been to Vermont in years, and even then, her memories were fragmented. A patchwork of fleeting summers and distant holidays spent with family she barely knew. The envelope had arrived weeks ago, inconspicuous among the mountain of legal briefs and corporate memos that defined her life. A slim, cream-colored rectangle, its contents as surprising as the sheer fact that it had been addressed to her at all. Inside, a handwritten letter and an official document informed her of a surprising inheritance. A small cafe called the North Pole, nestled in a town so obscure it might as well have been fictional. It had belonged to her Aunt Clara, a relative she recalled only faintly, a woman who had always seemed too eccentric to fit into Amara's structured world. Clara had passed away nearly a year ago, and now, inexplicably, the responsibility for her cherished cafe had landed in Amara's lap. The plan was straightforward: evaluate the property, settle any outstanding affairs, and sell it to the highest bidder. Amara's life in Boston didn't have room for quaint enterprises or sentimental attachments. She was a lawyer, and a good one, with a career that demanded precision and an unyielding focus. Vermont, with its quiet streets and snow-covered rooftops, felt as foreign to her as the idea of spending even a day away from her meticulously organized life. The train lurched to a halt at a small, unassuming station, a wooden structure whose faded green paint blended almost seamlessly with the winter landscape. Amara disembarked, her boots crunching against the snow-packed platform. The air was sharp, carrying a freshness that was startling after the smog-choked atmosphere of the city. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, scanning the station for any signs of life. There were none. The platform was deserted save for a single lamppost, its warm yellow glow casting a pool of light onto the otherwise shadowed surroundings. A cab, prearranged and waiting, idled at the curb beyond the station. The driver, a man whose face was obscured by a thick scarf and hat, loaded her luggage into the trunk without a word. The ride into town was silent, the snow muffling the world beyond the car's fogged windows. Amara's mind wandered as they drove through the quiet streets, the town's charm undeniable even in her preoccupied state. Quaint storefronts with garlands strung across their awnings, lampposts adorned with ribbons and wreaths, and the occasional flicker of warm light from frosted windows painted a picture of Christmas cheer. Yet the sight felt almost intrusive, as though she were peering into a world she didn't quite belong to. When the cab finally stopped, Amara stepped out into a scene that felt lifted straight from a holiday postcard. The cafe stood before her, a compact, two-story building with white clapboard siding and red shutters. Snow draped the roof in thick, uneven layers, while a string of twinkling lights framed the windows. Above the door, a hand-painted sign bore the words "The North Pole," the letters embellished with whimsical swirls. The sight was so quaint, so impossibly idyllic, that it took Amara a moment to process it. She reached into her coat pocket and retrieved the key that had accompanied Clara's letter. It was small, its ornate design more decorative than practical, and its metal was cool against her palm. She hesitated for a moment, her gloved fingers brushing against the frosted doorframe, before fitting the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing a space bathed in shadows. The air inside was still, carrying a faint scent of cinnamon and something richer, perhaps vanilla or caramel. Amara's hand fumbled against the wall until it found a light switch, and a series of pendant lamps flickered to life. The room was suddenly illuminated in a warm glow, revealing a cozy interior that seemed frozen in time. The walls were lined with shelves displaying jars of candy canes, tins of cocoa, and neatly wrapped pastries. Tables, each covered with red and white checkered cloths, were arranged haphazardly, as though awaiting customers who had long since left. In one corner stood a Christmas tree, its ornaments gleaming softly under the lights. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to have been touched recently, its tinsel carefully draped and its star perfectly positioned. Amara's gaze lingered on it, a faint pang of something, nostalgia? Longing? She couldn't tell, unfolding in her chest. She set her bag down on the counter, brushing away a thin layer of dust that clung to its polished surface. Her lawyer's mind began cataloging the tasks ahead. Repairs, an inventory check, finding a realtor. Yet, as she moved through the space, her steps echoing softly against the wooden floorboards, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cafe was more than just a property. It felt alive, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. Amara paused by the window, her reflection merging with the softly glowing lights outside. The town beyond seemed to hum with quiet anticipation, its streets blanketed in snow and its lampposts twinkling like stars. For a fleeting moment, she wondered what it would be like to belong to a place like this, to be a part of something so serene and steadfast. But the thought was fleeting, dismissed almost as soon as it formed. This wasn't her world. It never had been. Turning away, she let the curtain fall back into place. Tomorrow would bring appraisals, phone calls, and plans for an expedited sale. For now, though, she would settle into the small apartment upstairs, her temporary home in a town that already felt like a distant dream. And as she climbed the narrow staircase, the key still clutched in her hand, Amara couldn't help but feel that she was unlocking more than just a door. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Snow. The morning broke gently, pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows of the apartment above the cafe. Amara stirred from a restless sleep, the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards below her signaling the house's slow awakening. Wrapped in a blanket, she sat by the window with a cup of coffee, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out at the snow-drenched street below. The town seemed to exist in a perpetual state of quiet, its streets empty save for a lone figure shoveling snow from the steps of the general store across the way. The rhythmic scrape of the shovel against the pavement was the only sound, its monotony grounding her in the reality of her new surroundings. She took another sip, the warmth of the coffee contrasting sharply with the chill that seemed to seep through the old building's walls. The cafe waited below, a puzzle she had yet to piece together. After breakfast, she descended the narrow staircase, her steps echoing faintly in the empty space. The air still carried that faint hint of cinnamon and caramel, as if the scent had been baked into the walls. She paused at the base of the stairs, surveying the room in the morning light. It was the same as it had been last night, a snapshot of someone else's life, perfectly preserved and yet undeniably empty. Amara's first task was to assess the cafe's condition. She started behind the counter, opening drawers and cupboards to find neatly organized utensils, baking sheets, and stacks of faded recipe cards. Each card was written in the same looping handwriting, a script she vaguely recognized from Aunt Clara's holiday letters. The recipes spoke of another time, their ingredients simple yet comforting: spiced apple muffins, molasses cookies, and gingerbread loaves. They were relics of a life that felt so different from her own, a life measured in cups and teaspoons rather than billable hours and courtroom victories. The register, an old mechanical contraption, sat dormant on the counter. Its brass accents gleamed faintly under the light, and Amara couldn't help but run her fingers over its worn keys. Beside it was a small notebook filled with customer orders and scribbled notes. One entry caught her eye. Mrs. Whitaker loves the peppermint bark, double batch for next week. She closed the notebook gently, as though afraid to disturb the memories it held. Moving to the dining area, she wiped down the tables and chairs, her motions methodical and detached. Yet as she worked, her thoughts wandered. What had Clara been like in her final years? Had she been happy here, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of small-town life? Amara's memories of her aunt were faint at best. A woman with a hearty laugh, her hair always adorned with a festive clip or ribbon, who smelled faintly of vanilla and pine. Clara had loved Christmas in a way that felt almost mythical, a devotion Amara had never fully understood. The thought lingered as she ventured into the back room, a small storage space filled with neatly stacked boxes and jars of preserves. Here, too, Clara's touch was evident. Labels on each jar bore her handwriting, identifying their contents with care. Cranberry chutney, maple butter, spiced pear jam. Amara picked up one jar and held it to the light, the amber liquid catching the sun's rays. It was beautiful, in a way she couldn't quite articulate. By midday, the cafe felt a little less like a relic and more like a canvas. It still bore the weight of its history, but there was a quiet potential in its walls, a sense that it could be something more than a monument to Clara's life. Yet Amara reminded herself why she was here, to finalize its sale and return to Boston. This was a detour, nothing more. Stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, she was greeted by the stark brilliance of the afternoon sun reflecting off the snow. The town's stillness seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance or the far-off call of a bird. Amara walked along the narrow path that encircled the cafe, her boots crunching through the snow. She noted the building's exterior, its weathered wood and delicate trim, and made mental notes for potential repairs. The roof would need attention, as would the gutters and the porch steps, all small details that, once addressed, would likely increase the property's value. Her inspection led her to the side yard, where a small garden lay buried beneath the snow. Faint remnants of trellises and a bird bath peeked out from the white expanse, hinting at what must have been a vibrant space in warmer months. A rusted swing set stood at the far edge of the yard, its chains swaying gently in the breeze. She wondered if Clara had spent time here, tending to the plants or sitting in the shade of the old oak tree that towered over the space. Returning inside, Amara settled at one of the cafe's tables with her laptop, intent on researching the town's real estate market. The cafe's financials, inherited along with the property, painted a modest picture, enough to cover its expenses but far from lucrative. Yet its location in a picturesque, albeit remote, town might appeal to a niche buyer. She drafted emails to potential realtors, outlining her intentions and requesting their input. As the afternoon stretched on, a faint sense of restlessness crept over her. The cafe's quiet was almost oppressive, its silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant chime of a clock. Amara's life had been defined by noise, the hum of traffic, the buzz of phones, the constant chatter of colleagues. Here, the stillness left her with little to distract her from her thoughts. As evening approached, she stood by the window once more, watching as the town's lights began to twinkle against the encroaching dusk. A light snow had begun to fall, its flakes drifting lazily to the ground. There was a beauty to it, an almost hypnotic serenity that made her chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. Clara's cafe held secrets, she realized. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, unspoken ways that places steeped in memory often did. There were stories here, layered into the walls, etched into the scuffed floorboards, and nestled among the jars of preserves. And as much as Amara tried to focus on the practicalities of her visit, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cafe was asking something of her, to linger, to listen, to see. For now, though, she set the thought aside. The road ahead was clear, and she had no intention of straying from it. Yet as the snow fell softly outside and the cafe settled into the night, a small part of her wondered if the path she had so carefully mapped out was the only one she could take. Chapter 3: A Stranger's Recipe. The next morning arrived draped in the soft hues of winter dawn, the pale blue sky streaked with hints of lavender and gold. Amara stood by the window of the apartment, cradling a cup of tea in her hands. Below, the town remained in its slumber, the streets devoid of movement save for a few birds hopping across the snow-covered ground. The stillness felt heavy yet comforting, as though the world had momentarily paused to catch its breath. The cafe called to her, not with the urgency of a demanding task, but with the quiet insistence of something waiting to be discovered. After finishing her tea, she descended the narrow staircase, her footsteps muffled by the creaking wood. The air in the cafe was cool, the faint scent of cinnamon and caramel lingering like a memory. Sunlight streamed through the frosted windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the floor. Amara decided to start with the storeroom. It was a small space tucked behind the main counter, filled with boxes, jars, and an assortment of knickknacks that seemed to defy any organizational logic. She opened one of the boxes labeled Holiday Decorations and found an array of ornaments, each one unique. There were glass baubles painted with snowy scenes, miniature wooden reindeer, and a garland of bells that jingled softly as she lifted it from its nest of tissue paper. Her fingers brushed against a faded photograph tucked beneath the ornaments. It showed Clara standing in front of the cafe, her face alight with joy, a wreath in her hands. The image was dated but vivid, capturing a moment of unguarded happiness that seemed to radiate from the paper. Placing the photograph carefully aside, Amara continued her exploration. Each box she opened revealed a new layer of the cafe's history. Handwritten menus, receipts from local suppliers, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with Clara's musings. The notebook's pages were filled with sketches of recipe ideas, lists of seasonal produce, and snippets of poetry. One page in particular caught Amara's attention. The scent of evergreen lingers in the air, a reminder that even in the coldest seasons, life endures. This cafe is more than a business. It is a home, a refuge, a place where strangers become friends and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The words struck a chord, their sincerity cutting through the detachment Amara had maintained since arriving. Clara had poured her heart into this place, weaving herself into its walls and floorboards, into the very air that filled the space. The realization left Amara feeling both humbled and uneasy. She was here to dismantle this legacy, to prepare it for sale, and yet, shaking off the thought, she returned to the task at hand. By mid-morning, the storeroom was more organized, its shelves neatly arranged and its contents cataloged. Amara took a moment to survey her work before stepping back into the cafe. The sun had risen higher, and the light streaming through the windows was brighter, almost playful. She decided to tackle the kitchen next, a space she had only glanced at the previous day. The kitchen was a time capsule of mid-century design, its appliances sturdy and functional, but bearing the wear of decades. The counters were cluttered with mixing bowls, measuring cups, and jars of spices, each item arranged with a precision that spoke of frequent use. Amara began by sorting through the pantry, checking expiration dates and making notes of what might still be viable. She found jars of homemade preserves, neatly labeled and sealed, their contents gleaming like jewels. There were bags of flour and sugar, tins of cocoa, and an assortment of dried fruits and nuts, the building blocks of Clara's creations. As she worked, Amara's thoughts wandered to the town. What had drawn Clara here? What had kept her rooted in this quiet corner of the world while the rest of the family had scattered? The answers felt tantalizingly close, woven into the very fabric of the cafe, yet just out of reach. By early afternoon, Amara had made significant progress. The kitchen was clean and organized, its surfaces gleaming under the warm light of the pendant lamps. She stepped back into the main dining area, her gaze sweeping over the tables and chairs, the shelves of candy canes and cocoa tins. The cafe felt different now, less like a relic and more like a place waiting to come alive again. A knock at the door startled her. She turned to see a figure standing outside, bundled against the cold, their face obscured by a scarf and hat. They held a small box wrapped in brown paper. Amara hesitated for a moment before opening the door, the rush of cold air biting at her cheeks. The person handed her the box with a nod and then turned to leave, disappearing down the street before she could say anything. Closing the door, Amara carried the box to the counter and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a loaf of bread, its crust golden and its aroma rich with the scent of spices. A note lay atop it, written in the same looping handwriting as the recipe cards. "Welcome back to the North Pole. Some things are best experienced, not explained." Amara stared at the note, her heart racing. The words were simple yet profound, their meaning elusive but tantalizing. She placed the note and the bread aside, her mind swirling with questions. Who had left the package? How had they known she was here? The mystery added a new layer to the cafe's quiet allure, pulling her further into its world. As the day waned, Amara sat by the window once more, the loaf of bread untouched on the counter behind her. The snow had started to fall again, its flakes drifting lazily through the air. The town's lights began to flicker on one by one, their warm glow pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The cafe seemed to exhale, its walls holding a stillness that felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation. Amara's resolve to sell the cafe remained intact, but the edges of her certainty had begun to fray. The town, the cafe, Clara. They were no longer abstractions but pieces of a puzzle she felt compelled to understand. And as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet wonder, Amara couldn't help but feel that she was standing on the cusp of something she had yet to name. Chapter 4. Whispers of Pine and Cocoa. Morning arrived quietly, slipping into the cafe with the first rays of sunlight. Amara had woken earlier than usual, stirred from uneasy dreams she couldn't quite remember. She sat at the kitchen table in the apartment above the cafe, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm. The scent of the loaf of spiced bread from the previous day still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the crispness of winter that crept through the old windows. The note left with the bread occupied her thoughts, its simple words looping through her mind like a riddle. There was something about its tone that felt personal yet distant, as if it had been written with a knowledge of her that she couldn't understand. Amara found herself drawn to the cafe's quiet mysteries, the preserved recipes, the unspoken connections within the town, and now this anonymous gesture that seemed laden with meaning. It unsettled her in a way that she didn't entirely dislike. Deciding that action might temper her restless energy, Amara descended the stairs to the cafe. The air below was cooler, touched by the chill that had settled overnight. The faint creaks of the wooden floor beneath her steps were the only sounds as she crossed the dining area to the counter. Her eyes landed on the bread again, still sitting where she had left it on a plate, its golden crust catching the soft morning light. She broke off a piece and tasted it, expecting nothing more than a pleasant bite of spiced sweetness. But the flavor was something else entirely, warm and deeply familiar, like a memory made tangible. It carried the essence of Christmas mornings she hadn't thought about in years, the aroma of Clara's baking filling the house as snow fell outside. Amara's throat tightened unexpectedly, and she set the bread down, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of nostalgia. It was as if the bread itself carried echoes of the past, whispering of moments she had long since buried. The day stretched before her with an unsettling openness. She wasn't used to unstructured time, to hours unclaimed by deadlines and obligations. The cafe demanded her attention, but not in the way her legal cases did. Its quiet presence seemed almost patient, as though waiting for her to uncover its purpose. Amara decided to begin in earnest with the financial records she'd found in Clara's office. The room was small and unassuming, tucked away at the back of the cafe behind a door that blended seamlessly with the wall. Inside, the scent of aged paper mingled with the faintest hint of pine. The desk was cluttered with ledgers, receipts, and notebooks, each item meticulously labeled in Clara's handwriting. The ledgers told a story of modest but steady success. Clara had run the cafe not for profit, it seemed, but as a labor of love. There were notes about seasonal changes in inventory, handwritten reminders about favorite customers' preferences, and even a few entries that suggested barter trades with local suppliers. Amara's fingers brushed across the pages, her eyes tracing the careful script. It was a portrait of a life spent nurturing something beyond mere sustenance, a community, a tradition, a home. Among the papers, she found a small leather-bound book that stood out from the rest. Its cover was embossed with a simple wreath design, and when she opened it, she realized it wasn't a financial record at all. Instead, it was a journal, Clara's private thoughts, recorded over years of running the cafe. Amara hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but curiosity got the better of her. The entries were brief but evocative, capturing snapshots of Clara's days. December 12, 2008. Snow falling all day. Mrs. Whitaker came in for her usual peppermint bark and stayed to share stories of her grandchildren. The cafe feels alive on days like this. March 3, 2011. First daffodils spotted near the garden. The air smells of thawing earth. Spent the morning baking lemon scones, sold out by noon. Life moves gently here. November 15, 2016. Amara sent a card for my birthday. Short but sweet. She's so busy now, always chasing something. I hope she finds it. Amara's heart caught at the last entry, the words striking her with an unexpected force. She closed the journal carefully, her mind swimming with questions and emotions she wasn't ready to confront. The rest of the day unfolded in small, deliberate steps. Amara cleaned and organized, moving through the cafe with a sense of purpose that felt both foreign and natural. She polished the brass accents on the register, rearranged the jars of preserves on their shelves, and swept the floorboards until they gleamed. Each task brought a small measure of satisfaction, as though she were restoring not just the space but something within herself. By late afternoon, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow outside. Amara stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The town was quiet, the stillness broken only by the occasional crunch of boots on snow as a passerby made their way down the street. She watched as a child ran ahead of their parent, their laughter echoing faintly in the crisp air. The sight stirred something within her, a faint but persistent longing she couldn't quite name. As the light faded, Amara returned to the cafe. She stood in the center of the dining area, letting the silence envelop her. The space felt different now, less like a relic of Clara's life and more like a living, breathing entity. It was as if the cafe itself had been waiting for her, its walls holding secrets she was only beginning to uncover. Amara's gaze fell on the loaf of bread, still resting on the counter. She broke off another piece, the flavors once again transporting her to a place she couldn't fully articulate. The cafe held a weight she hadn't anticipated, a pull that both unsettled and intrigued her. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if leaving, if returning to the life she had so carefully constructed, was truly what she wanted. The thought lingered as she climbed the stairs to the apartment, her steps slow and deliberate. The night deepened around her, the stars glinting coldly in the clear sky, and as she lay in bed, the cafe below her seemed to hum with quiet possibilities, its history pressing against her thoughts like forgotten footsteps in the snow. Chapter 5. The Carpenter's Secret. The next day began with a pale sun rising behind a veil of thin clouds, casting the town in a subdued glow. Amara's routine had shifted imperceptibly over the past few days. Where she might once have avoided stepping foot into the cafe until necessity compelled her, she now found herself descending the stairs with a sense of quiet anticipation. Something about the space, its history, its warmth, its unanswered questions, drew her back time and time again. The day's air carried the kind of sharpness that warned of heavier snowfall to come. Amara bundled herself in a thick cardigan and moved through the cafe with practiced ease. She began by lighting the small fireplace near the corner seating area. The flames caught quickly, their orange glow softening the room's edges and creating a cozy refuge from the cold pressing against the windows. As the fire crackled, Amara turned her attention to the shelves that lined one wall of the cafe. They were filled with books, jars, and other curiosities Clara had collected over the years. Some were purely decorative, tiny glass figurines shaped like angels, a faded globe with outdated borders, a wooden cuckoo clock that had long since stopped ticking. Others seemed more practical. Cookbooks, gardening guides, and what appeared to be a journal with its pages pressed tight as though guarding secrets. She hesitated before reaching for the journal, unsure of why her hand wavered. When she finally opened it, she found it was more of a scrapbook than a diary. Newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes filled its pages, each item carefully secured with yellowing tape or paper clips. One photograph in particular caught her eye. It showed the cafe from decades earlier, its facade freshly painted, the windows adorned with wreaths and garlands. Clara stood at the forefront, her smile radiant and her hands clasped with those of a man Amara didn't recognize. She studied the man's face. He appeared to be in his 30s, with a strong jawline and eyes that sparkled even in the monochrome image. There was an ease in his posture, a warmth that seemed to mirror Clara's. Turning the photograph over, Amara found a note scrawled in Clara's handwriting. December 1957. Our first Christmas together. The words lingered in Amara's mind as she flipped through more pages. The scrapbook painted a vivid picture of Clara's life beyond the cafe. The community events she had organized, the friendships she had nurtured, the milestones she had celebrated. But there were also hints of challenges, brief mentions of financial struggles, a cryptic entry about saving the cafe, and a faded letter folded neatly between two pages. Amara unfolded the letter carefully, the brittle paper crinkling in her hands. The ink had faded, but was still legible. Dear Clara, I know you worry about the future, about the cafe and everything we've built together. But trust that the roots we've planted here are strong. This place isn't just ours. It belongs to the town, to the people who come through its doors seeking warmth and comfort. No matter what happens, the North Pole will endure. With love, James. Amara's chest tightened as she read the words. She wondered who James was. The man in the photograph, perhaps? His presence, even through these artifacts, felt profound. The cafe wasn't just Clara's passion. It had been a shared dream, a partnership built on hope and resilience. The realization added another layer to the weight Amara felt pressing against her decision to sell. This place wasn't merely a business. It was a testament to lives intertwined with the town's history. By mid-morning, Amara's hands were dusted with flour and sugar as she attempted one of the simpler recipes from Clara's collection. The kitchen filled with the scent of baking cookies, the aroma wrapping around her like an embrace. It was a strange but satisfying feeling, this act of creation. She didn't consider herself much of a baker, but there was something meditative about measuring ingredients, kneading dough, and watching the oven transform her efforts into something tangible. While the cookies cooled, she stepped outside for a moment to clear her mind. The snow had begun to fall, delicate flakes spiraling down in a lazy dance. The world felt hushed, as though holding its breath. Across the street, a group of children bundled in bright coats and scarves worked to build a snowman. Their laughter carried faintly through the cold air, a reminder of the simple joys that winter brought. Amara's gaze drifted back to the cafe sign. The letters spelling out the North Pole were slightly weathered but still charming, their painted edges dusted with snow. She thought again of Clara and James, of the life they had poured into this place. The enormity of their legacy pressed against her, its significance both daunting and inspiring. What would Clara think of her granddaughter now, standing here on the verge of letting it all go? As the afternoon stretched on, Amara returned to her tasks with a newfound sense of purpose. She arranged the cookies on a platter and set them on one of the cafe's small tables, their warm, inviting scent filling the room. Then she tackled the task of decorating. Clara's collection of ornaments and garlands came to life under Amara's careful hands. She strung lights around the windows, hung wreaths on the walls, and placed candles on the tables, their soft glow adding to the atmosphere. By the time evening arrived, the cafe felt transformed. The fireplace crackled warmly, the decorations cast gentle shadows across the walls, and the scent of cookies mingled with the faint aroma of pine. Amara stepped back to survey her work, a rare sense of pride blooming in her chest. She hadn't intended to invest herself in this place, but now she couldn't deny the connection she felt. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing the town in pristine white. The streetlights cast halos of light onto the sidewalks, and the occasional figure passed by, their steps muffled by the snow. Amara stood by the window, her reflection superimposed on the scene outside. The cafe's interior glowed warmly behind her, a beacon of comfort in the winter night. As the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Amara felt the weight of the day settle over her. The cafe had begun to reveal its secrets, but with each answer came new questions. Who had left the loaf of bread? What had driven Clara to pour so much of herself into this place? And what, if anything, was Amara meant to do with it all? The night deepened, and Amara turned off the lights one by one, leaving the fireplace's glow to flicker in the quiet darkness. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, the faint scent of pine and cinnamon following her. As she lay in bed, the snow continued to fall, and the North Pole Café seemed to hum with a life of its own, its stories still waiting to be told. Chapter 6: December's Call. The first light of dawn crept over the snowy landscape, spilling its muted glow through the frost-edged windows of the North Pole Café. Amara stirred from a fitful sleep, her mind a tangle of thoughts that refused to settle. The scrapbook she had pored over the day before lingered vividly in her memory, its pages full of lives and connections she hadn't known existed. Clara and James, the man from the photograph, the author of the heartfelt letter, seemed like figures from a dream, their presence both distant and hauntingly close. As the morning stretched ahead, Amara pulled herself from bed and dressed in layers to combat the chill. She descended the stairs to the cafe, the creak of each step echoing in the stillness. The space below was exactly as she had left it, the warm, golden light from the garlands she had strung still casting a gentle glow, the scent of pine and cinnamon faint but lingering. Yet the silence felt heavier today, as though the cafe itself were waiting for something. Her first task was simple and methodical. She took inventory of the pantry, jotting down the supplies that were running low and marking items she might need to replenish. Clara's organizational system was meticulous, a testament to her years of dedication. The pantry shelves held jars of preserves, neatly labeled spices, and tins of tea that seemed almost too beautiful to open. Amara couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration and guilt. She had inherited a legacy built with such care, and yet she had arrived with the intention of discarding it. Midway through her work, Amara's attention was drawn to a box tucked into the corner of the pantry. Unlike the other neatly arranged items, this box appeared hastily stashed away, its lid slightly askew. She knelt to pull it out, brushing away a thin layer of dust that had settled on the top. Inside, she found an assortment of items: old postcards, faded photographs, and letters folded so many times their creases threatened to tear. She picked up one of the letters, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was Clara's, and the words were addressed to someone named Helen. Helen, the days grow shorter, and the nights feel colder without your voice. I find myself lingering at the counter, listening for the bell above the door, hoping it will ring and you will be there. The cafe isn't the same without your laughter, your kindness that warmed even the darkest days. James says I should let the hurt go, that time will mend what's broken. But I don't know if time has that kind of power. Always, Clara asterisk. The letter ended abruptly, as if Clara hadn't known how to put her feelings into words. Amara placed it back in the box, her heart heavy with questions. Who was Helen? What had happened between her and Clara? The discovery painted another layer of depth onto her grandmother's life, one that Amara hadn't expected. It was as if Clara's history was a tapestry, each thread revealing more complexity and emotion than the last. The hours passed as Amara worked through the items in the box. Each letter, photograph, and memento seemed to tell a story, but none provided the full picture. It was both frustrating and fascinating, this piecing together of a life that felt so familiar and yet so foreign. By the time she emerged from the pantry, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, its light reflecting off the snow in dazzling patterns. Amara decided to step outside for a break. The cold air was sharp against her skin, but it cleared her mind in a way the warmth of the cafe couldn't. She walked down the porch steps, her boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The town was quiet, as it often was during the mid-morning hours. Most of the shops hadn't yet opened, and the streets carried an air of serene stillness. She wandered aimlessly, her thoughts turning over the discoveries of the morning. The cafe had always felt like Clara's realm, a space imbued with her energy and spirit. But now it seemed to hold echoes of so many others: James, Helen, the countless customers who had passed through its doors. Amara couldn't shake the feeling that her own presence was part of a larger narrative, one she hadn't yet fully grasped. Returning to the cafe, Amara was struck by how different it looked in the afternoon light. The warm glow of the garlands seemed subdued, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. She rekindled the flames and set about preparing a simple lunch. The act of cooking, though unfamiliar, had begun to take on a comforting rhythm. It was a small way of grounding herself, of connecting to the space in a tangible way. As the day wore on, the snow outside grew heavier. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside, creating a soft barrier between the coziness of the cafe and the stark cold of the world beyond. Amara found herself drawn back to Clara's journal, which she had left on the counter the previous day. She opened it to a random entry, her eyes scanning the page. January 2nd, 2015. The new year feels heavy with possibilities. James would have wanted me to keep going, to find joy in the cafe and the people who make it come alive. But there are days when the emptiness feels too vast to fill. The cafe is my anchor, and yet it sometimes feels like a weight I can't carry. Amara closed the journal, her chest tightening. She hadn't known how deeply Clara had struggled, how much of herself she had poured into keeping the cafe alive. It was a revelation that both humbled and unsettled her. If Clara had found the strength to persevere, what excuse did Amara have for walking away? The night fell quickly, as it often did in winter, wrapping the town in a blanket of quiet darkness. Amara lit the candles she had placed on the tables, their flickering light casting shadows that danced across the walls. The cafe felt alive in a way she couldn't quite explain, as though it were responding to her presence, urging her to see it not just as a place, but as a living, breathing entity. As she sat by the fire, the snow continued to fall outside, its steady descent hypnotic. The weight of the day settled over her like a quilt, heavy but not unwelcome. She thought of Clara, of James, of Helen, and all the others whose lives had been touched by this place. The cafe was more than a building. It was a repository of stories, a keeper of memories, a home for those seeking refuge. And for the first time, Amara wondered if it could be her home, too. Chapter 7. Beneath the tinsel. The snowstorm had deepened overnight, blanketing the town in a serene, undisturbed white. By morning, the light filtering through the frost-framed windows was diffuse, lending the North Pole Café an almost ethereal glow. Amara awoke to the muffled quiet of a world slowed by snow. Her apartment above the cafe, with its sloped ceilings and drafty corners, had become a space she found herself growing fond of, though she would never admit it aloud. Descending the narrow staircase, she was met by the sight of the cafe bathed in soft light. The garlands she had strung twinkled faintly, their lights catching the golden sheen of the ornaments nestled among the greenery. The fireplace was cold, its warmth from the previous evening nothing more than a memory. She crossed the room and knelt to light the kindling, coaxing flames to life with a patience she hadn't realized she possessed. The day felt heavier than most, burdened by the weight of unanswered questions. Amara's mind drifted back to the scrapbook, the letters, the lingering presence of names she didn't fully understand. Clara's life had been so intertwined with the cafe and the town, a series of connections that seemed impossible to unravel. Yet Amara couldn't ignore the pull of those mysteries, the way they whispered to her like the wind slipping through cracks in the window panes. She busied herself with the morning's chores, falling into a rhythm that had become strangely comforting. The cafe's floors were swept, the tables wiped down, and the counter organized with a precision she hadn't thought herself capable of. As she worked, the world outside remained still, the only movement the occasional drift of snow sliding from rooftops. Midway through the morning, she ventured into the pantry. The box she had discovered the day before still sat on the counter where she had left it, its contents a jumble of memories waiting to be pieced together. Amara's fingers brushed the edges of a postcard, its image faded with age. The scene depicted a snowy mountainside, its peaks shrouded in mist, and on the back was a brief note in Clara's familiar handwriting. "James and I visited here on our first trip together." He said the mountains reminded him of home. The sentiment was simple, yet it carried an intimacy that made Amara pause. She set the postcard aside and continued sifting through the box. Each item seemed to deepen the sense of loss and longing that permeated the cafe, as though the very walls held the weight of Clara's memories. And yet there was something else, too, a quiet resilience, an enduring hope that spoke to the heart of what this place had meant to her grandmother. After returning the items to the box, Amara decided to take a break. She stepped outside, the icy air biting at her cheeks and turning her breath to clouds. The snow had piled high against the cafe's porch, and the street beyond was a smooth expanse of white, unmarred by footprints or tire tracks. The stillness was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of branches weighed down by snow. Amara's gaze drifted to the distant hills, their outlines softened by the storm. She remembered the photograph of Clara and James, the way they had stood together with an ease that spoke of shared dreams and quiet understanding. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the Clara she had known, practical, self-reliant, and fiercely independent. The letters and photographs hinted at a woman far more complex, a life rich with emotion and connection. The cold eventually drove her back inside, where she resumed her tasks. By afternoon, the cafe had taken on its usual warmth, the fire burning steadily and the scent of pine mingling with hints of cinnamon and nutmeg. Amara prepared a batch of scones, following a recipe she had found tucked away in Clara's collection. The process was messy and imperfect, but the end result was passable. She arranged them on a plate and set them on the counter, their golden tops glistening faintly. As the snow continued to fall, Amara found herself drawn to the window. She watched as the streetlights flickered on, their soft halos illuminating the snow-covered road. The town seemed to exhale under the weight of the storm, its usual hum of activity replaced by a contemplative stillness. It was a scene that might have felt isolating, but instead it felt oddly comforting, as though the world had paused just for her. Her thoughts returned to Clara's journal, the entry she had read the day before. The words had stayed with her, their vulnerability and honesty a stark contrast to the woman she had known. Clara had written of the cafe as both an anchor and a weight, a place that grounded her even as it demanded so much of her. Amara couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to understand that sentiment. By evening, the storm had lessened, the heavy snowfall giving way to a light, steady flurry. The cafe's interior was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace and candles, their light reflecting off the garlands and ornaments. Amara sat at one of the tables, a cup of tea in her hands, her gaze fixed on the flames. The quiet was profound, broken only by the occasional pop of wood in the fire. It was in this solitude that Amara began to feel the stirrings of something she couldn't quite name. The cafe, with all its history and secrets, had started to feel less like a burden and more like an opportunity. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could she truly take on this legacy with all its complexities and contradictions? Or was she fooling herself, clinging to an idea that wasn't meant for her? As the night deepened, Amara allowed herself to sit with those questions, the flickering light of the fire her only companion. The cafe seemed to hum softly around her, its presence as steady and unyielding as the snow outside. Whatever answers lay ahead, she knew they would not come easily. But for now, she let the quiet wrap around her, a moment of peace in the midst of uncertainty. Chapter 8. The Window to Wonder. The days had begun to shorten, and the nights had grown colder in Maple Ridge, each evening more enveloped by the thick darkness that wrapped the town in its stillness. Amara had become accustomed to the rhythm of the seasons here, a stark contrast to the bustling pace she had left behind. There was a kind of grace in the quietness of it all, an unspoken invitation to slow down, to breathe deeper, to notice what had always been there. Yet, despite the town's serene exterior, there was a restlessness that had begun to stir beneath the surface of her heart. The cafe, once a strange and foreign thing to her, had become a part of her daily life. She no longer looked at it with the same uncertainty or trepidation. She had learned to move among its worn counters, its creaking floorboards, and the smell of old wood and spices that seemed to cling to the walls. She had found a kind of rhythm in the routines, the opening of the door in the early morning to let in the first light, the quiet buzz of the coffee machine, the act of wiping down the tables, as if in some small way she were erasing the past, starting fresh. Yet, with each passing day, she also felt the pull of something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. There was a subtle change in the air, an unspoken shift that began to stir within the very walls of the cafe. It was as though the building, like her, was waking up, becoming more alive with each passing moment. She found herself lingering longer, staring out of the window, watching the snow drift by as the world outside seemed to fall asleep under the cover of night. The cafe, with its flickering lights and gentle warmth, had become a refuge, a a sanctuary of sorts. Amara had always been a creature of habit, and her mornings followed a familiar path. The first rays of sunlight would filter through the tall trees that lined the street, casting long, dappled shadows across the snow. The air would feel crisp, biting at her cheeks as she stepped outside to make her way to the cafe. She had learned how to deal with the old, creaky heating system, the stubborn plumbing that often froze in the dead of winter, and the minor inconveniences that came with owning an old building in a small town. But she had also learned something else. The way that each moment spent inside the cafe seemed to shift something in her, like the gradual turning of a page in a book she didn't yet understand. One particularly cold evening, as the sky above Maple Ridge seemed to grow darker earlier than usual, Amara found herself closing up shop just as the final light of the day faded away. She had no customers that night, the last of them having left hours ago, leaving her alone in the empty cafe. The stillness of the place seemed to hum with a quiet energy, and as she swept the last of the crumbs into the dustpan, her mind drifted once again to the mysterious door at the back of the cafe. She had never dared open it, always sensing that it held some untold secret, something she wasn't ready to face. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt a strange pull toward it. The door had always been a fixture, blending into the background of the cafe as though it were just another part of the room. Yet tonight, in the dim light, it seemed different. The soft glow of the fireplace cast long shadows against the wall, and the door, once just a part of the scenery, now felt like a portal, something waiting to be discovered. Amara stood for a long moment, staring at the door. The quiet of the cafe surrounded her, and the world outside seemed a distant memory. The wind howled softly through the cracks in the windows, but inside, the warmth and stillness offered an odd sense of safety, as though the building itself were protecting her from whatever lay beyond. Her fingers brushed against the old wooden frame as she stepped closer, her breath quickening ever so slightly. The handle, smooth from years of use, was cool to the touch, and for a moment, she hesitated. What was behind this door? And why, after all this time, had it never been opened? A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this moment, this quiet, private moment, was a decision. A decision that would change the course of her life, just as the cafe had done when she first stepped through its doors. With a soft creak, the door gave way, opening into the small room beyond. It was not large, but its contents were enough to take her breath away. It was filled with a dusty collection of old furniture, much of it draped in faded sheets. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars, papers, and small trinkets that looked as though they had been untouched for years. The air smelled faintly of old books and wood, and the dim light from the cafe seemed to stretch into the corners, illuminating the forgotten relics of another time. Her eyes fell upon a large wooden chest in the center of the room. It was old, its edges worn with age, and it stood in stark contrast to the other, more fragile items scattered around. It seemed to call to her, pulling her closer, as if it held the answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. Without thinking, Amara knelt down and opened the chest. Inside, she found an assortment of items: photographs, journals, and old letters, their yellowed pages curling at the edges. The handwriting was familiar, but the words seemed distant, as though they were written by someone she had never known. The contents of the chest seemed to carry the weight of the past, of a life lived in this very place, now lost to time. As she sifted through the items, her fingers brushed against something small and metallic, a delicate key attached to a thin chain. It was simple in design, but it felt heavy in her hand, as though it held the key to something far greater than she could comprehend. She held it up to the light, her mind racing with questions. What did it unlock? And why had it been hidden here, buried beneath layers of forgotten history? Amara stood in the room for a long time, lost in the weight of the past, as the quiet of the night pressed in on her from all sides. The cafe, the town, the people who had come before her, all of it seemed to converge in this one moment. The stars outside, barely visible through the thick clouds of winter, seemed to watch over her in silence, as though waiting for her to take the next step. The key, cold in her palm, felt like a promise that there was something more, something beyond the quiet walls of the cafe, something she had yet to discover. The rest of the world could wait. For tonight, the only thing that mattered was the path she had just begun to walk. Chapter 9. Frozen in Time. The key sat heavy in Amara's pocket for days after she found it, its cold weight a constant reminder of the secret that seemed to beckon her from the shadows of the cafe's hidden room. She had tucked it away in a corner of her mind, though the thought of it never quite left her. Every time her fingers brushed against the fabric of her coat, she could feel its cool presence, waiting for the moment when she would finally find the courage to unlock whatever was hidden behind that forgotten door. In the days that followed, the town of Maple Ridge seemed to grow quieter still. The snow, which had fallen in soft flakes from the sky, had turned to an endless blanket of white that covered every inch of the world outside. The streets were all but empty, save for the occasional figure wrapped in layers of winter clothing, moving swiftly to their destinations. Even the town's small shops seemed to have closed early, as if the cold had ushered everyone inside, drawing them into the warmth of their homes. Amara felt the pull of the cafe more deeply now, as though the building itself had taken root in her, filling a space that had long been barren. The outside world felt distant, an echo she could no longer hear clearly, while inside, the cafe became more familiar, more intimate, each creaking floorboard and cracked window pane an old friend. She had settled into a routine of sorts: morning coffee, afternoons spent cleaning and organizing, and evenings filled with silence. Her only company the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. The sense of isolation she had initially felt when she arrived had given way to something different. She no longer felt so disconnected from the world, and yet there was still a distance, something unspoken, lingering in the air like the scent of pine and cinnamon that seemed to haunt the cafe's corners. It was as though the very walls of the place were steeped in memories, in things left unsaid. The longer she stayed, the more she wondered what had happened here before her arrival, what had once lived within these walls, and, most importantly, what had been left behind. It was on one of those quiet evenings, when the cafe was empty and the light from the fire in the hearth flickered softly, that Amara felt the urge to confront the hidden room once more. The key, now worn smooth from the repeated motion of her fingers, seemed to whisper to her, urging her to act. She stood for a long time in the middle of the cafe, staring at the back door, now a familiar fixture that had begun to seem almost expectant. It wasn't fear that held her back this time, but a sense of reverence. Whatever lay behind that door was a piece of history, a connection to the past that she had not yet been able to piece together. She needed to understand it, to find the thread that would tie the cafe's past to her own future. With a steady hand, she retrieved the key from her pocket. The air in the cafe was still, thick with the weight of the decision she was about to make. She moved toward the door, feeling the floor creak beneath her feet as though the building itself were holding its breath. When her fingers closed around the handle, it felt different this time. Not just cold, but alive, as if the door had been waiting for her all along. She turned the key, and with a soft click, the lock gave way. The door opened slowly, revealing the small room beyond. It was as she had left it, undisturbed by the passage of time. The chest still sat in the center of the room, and the shelves were stacked with the forgotten remnants of another life. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of aged paper and wood filled her lungs as she stepped inside. But something was different now. The room seemed less like a relic of the past and more like a place that was waiting to be discovered, a space filled with potential, as if it were ready to offer up its secrets. Amara walked slowly around the room, her fingers brushing against the old furniture, the edges of forgotten books, and the spines of journals filled with pages of faded ink. She was drawn once again to the chest in the center of the room, the one that had beckoned her so many days ago. This time, she didn't hesitate. She knelt down before it, running her fingers over the worn surface of the wood. The chest felt solid, sturdy, as if it had been meant to hold something important, something that had been locked away for a reason. With a soft groan, she lifted the lid. Inside, the same collection of items lay, but there was one addition now, a thick, leather-bound journal resting on top of the other contents. It was different from the rest, newer, its pages still crisp and unworn. She picked it up, the weight of it heavy in her hands. As she flipped it open, she saw the handwriting immediately, its careful loops and slants unmistakable. It was her uncle's handwriting, a fact that made her heart skip a beat. This was his journal, the key she had found, the chest, the room itself. Everything was beginning to make sense. The journal contained a collection of thoughts, observations, and notes that seemed at first to be little more than the musings of a quiet man. But as Amara read further, she began to understand. Her uncle had loved the cafe, loved it in a way that was deeper than she had ever imagined. He had built it with his own hands, pouring his heart into its walls, and over the years, he had carefully cultivated a legacy, one that had been left behind for her to find. The pages spoke of the early days of the cafe, its opening, the long hours spent in the kitchen, the first customers who came and went, the friendships that had blossomed and faded over time. There were notes about the town, about the way things had changed and the people who had come and gone. But there were also secrets, things her uncle had kept hidden, things that only someone with a deep connection to the land and the people of Maple Ridge would understand. Amara's eyes lingered on a particular passage, where her uncle spoke of the cafe's true purpose, something that had been lost with time. It was meant to be more than a cafe. It was meant to be a gathering place for the heart of the community, a place where people could come together, find solace, and heal. The North Pole Café had once been a sanctuary, a refuge for those who needed it, a space where laughter and tears could coexist in the warmth of its walls. As she read, Amara felt a growing sense of responsibility. The cafe was more than just a building to be managed. It was a place steeped in history, a place that had been built with love, and a place that had the power to heal. She had always thought of it as a burden, something to escape from. But now, as she stood in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the echoes of the past, she realized that the cafe had chosen her, not just because of the inheritance, but because it had known, even before she did, that she was the one who could bring it back to life. She closed the journal, holding it close to her chest, and for the first time since she had arrived in Maple Ridge, she felt a sense of belonging. The cafe had become part of her story, and in return, it had begun to weave its own threads into the fabric of her life. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was part of something greater, something enduring, something that would outlast time itself. And in the quiet of the room, beneath the soft glow of the firelight, Amara finally understood the true meaning of home. Chapter 10. The Mistletoe Threshold. The snow fell relentlessly in the days that followed, blanketing Maple Ridge under a thick layer of white. It was as though the town had been swaddled in a soft, silent veil that muted all sound and softened the harsh edges of the world. The streets had become rivers of snow and ice, and the buildings, once so familiar, seemed to disappear beneath the heavy weight of winter's grasp. The world outside had grown distant, a place Amara no longer felt connected to, as if her life had become a quiet rhythm that existed only in the warmth of the cafe. surrounded by the fading glow of the hearth and the soft light of the lanterns she had placed by the windows. The journal, with its careful entries and its revelations, had left Amara with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. It had drawn her deeper into the life of the cafe, not just as its new owner, but as its caretaker, its protector. She had long known that she was here for a reason, but it was only now, after reading her uncle's words, that she understood the weight of that reason. The cafe was not just a building to her. It was a legacy, a testament to the strength of a community, a place where life could be celebrated and sorrow could be eased. The key, the chest, the journal, all of it had led her to this moment, where the cafe had become her home in ways she could not fully explain. The days had blurred together, with little distinction between one and the next. Each morning, Amara would rise early, her breath misting in the cold air as she stepped out of the small cottage where she had taken up residence. She no longer felt the sharp pang of loneliness that had once been a constant companion. The mornings had become quiet rituals, carefully preparing her coffee, sweeping the floor of the cafe, and taking stock of what needed to be done. It wasn't until the afternoon, when the cafe was quiet, that her thoughts would often drift back to the chest and the key. Though she had unlocked the door to the room and found the journal, something still felt unfinished, as if there were more to discover, more to understand. The cafe, like the town itself, held secrets in its walls, things that were not so easily uncovered. She had only begun to scratch the surface, and though part of her longed to know everything all at once, another part of her understood that the answers would come in time. They had to, just as the seasons shifted and the snow would eventually melt to reveal the earth beneath. So too would the layers of the past gradually reveal themselves, bit by bit. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Amara decided to take a walk, to step outside the safety of the cafe and into the world beyond. She had been inside for too long, and something stirred in her, a desire to see what lay beyond the confines of her thoughts. She needed space to breathe, to clear her mind, and perhaps to see the town in a new light. The snow had begun to fall harder, but she welcomed the chill against her skin as she wrapped herself tightly in her scarf and coat. The quiet of the town, muffled by the falling snow, felt strangely comforting as she walked down the street, her footsteps soft against the deep snowdrifts that lined the path. As she moved deeper into town, Amara found herself passing the places that had once seemed so foreign to her. The bakery, the general store, the town square. She had grown accustomed to these places, to the soft smiles of the shopkeepers and the familiarity of their greetings. But it was different now. The town had become more than just a setting for her story. It was a living thing, a place that was slowly revealing itself to her, layer by layer. The more she wandered through the streets, the more she felt herself drawn into its quiet pulse, the beating heart of a community that, despite the isolation of the season, seemed to be thriving in its own way. It was when she reached the far end of town, where the trees grew thick and the road began to wind into the woods, that Amara paused. The world had fallen eerily still, the air so thick with snow that it felt as though the entire world had been swallowed by the quiet. She had walked this path before, but never with this sense of purpose, this feeling that she was standing on the edge of something significant. It was here, in the heart of the forest, that she realized just how far she had come. This place, this town, had become part of her story in ways she had never expected. She had thought of it as a place to escape, to retreat from the pressures of her old life, but now it felt like a home she had been searching for without even knowing it. She stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall in delicate, swirling patterns around her. It was as though time itself had slowed down, stretching out the moments so that each one felt infinitely more significant than it had before. And then, as if by instinct, her eyes were drawn back to the cafe. She could see its faint outline through the trees, its lights glowing faintly in the distance, a beacon in the darkness. Amara knew, without a doubt, that it was time to return. When she reached the cafe once more, the door creaked open, welcoming her back into its warmth. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air, a comforting reminder of the life that had begun to take root here. There was something deeply soothing about the cafe's presence, as though it were a silent partner in her journey, watching over her as she slowly discovered her place within its walls. It was more than just a building now. It had become a symbol of everything she had come to understand about herself, about healing, about belonging, and about the quiet strength that could be found in even the most unlikely of places. The cafe, with all its secrets and memories, seemed to be waiting for her to take the next step. She had found the journal, and she had read the stories written within its pages. But it wasn't enough to simply uncover the past. The key had unlocked more than just a door. It had unlocked a future she had yet to understand, a future that was bound up in the threads of the town, the cafe, and the people she had yet to meet. As the wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall in soft, swirling blankets, Amara sat at one of the cafe's worn tables, the journal resting open in front of her. She had read it once, but now, as the fire flickered before her, she realized that it was time to read it again, this time with a new understanding. Each page held a story, but it was the silence between the words that spoke the loudest. And in that silence, she found the answers she had been seeking. The cafe was not just a place to rest. It was a place to grow. The snow outside may have fallen endlessly, but inside, Amara felt something shift. She was no longer just passing through this life. She was living it, here, in the quiet of the cafe, where every falling snowflake felt like a promise. The weight of snowfall pressed against the windows, but inside, Amara felt the warmth of something far more enduring. It was time to step forward, to uncover the next layer of the story. Chapter 11. Warmth in the Shadows. The days leading up to Christmas felt as though they were suspended in time, each one stretching into the next like the endless stretch of snow across the town. The world outside the cafe had become a place of frosted stillness, where the trees stood bare against the backdrop of an ever-clouded sky, their branches heavy with snow that seemed to weigh down the very air. The streets were quieter now, fewer people ventured out, and the bustle of the town had slowed to a soft hum, as though everyone was holding their breath in anticipation of the coming holiday. Amara had grown used to the rhythm of the town and the cafe, an easy flow of routine that brought her a sense of peace, but also a sense of restlessness. The cafe was a sanctuary, but there were moments when she could not shake the feeling that it was holding something back from her. There were times when she would stand in the middle of the room, her fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of the tables, and she would feel the walls pressing in, as though they too were waiting for something to happen, something to shift. It was early one morning, just as the first light of dawn began to spill through the cafe windows, that Amara felt the shift she had been waiting for. The air outside was crisp, a biting cold that seeped through the walls despite the warmth of the fire she had stoked the night before. As she moved about the cafe, preparing for the day, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't just the season, with Christmas only days away. It was something more, something unspoken, yet undeniable. The cafe was nearly ready for the day's business when a knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. It was unexpected, the sound carrying in the quiet morning as a sudden disruption. She had been lost in her own thoughts, running over the details of the coming week in her mind. The decorations, the preparations, the little touches that would make the Christmas season feel more alive. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. Amara opened the door to find the town's mail carrier standing at the threshold, a heavy package wrapped in brown paper clutched in his arms. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he held the package that made her pause. "For you," he said simply, his voice low and heavy against the stillness of the morning. He placed the package in her hands, and without another word, he turned and walked back down the path, disappearing into the snowstorm that had begun to swirl in from the east. Amara stood there for a moment, the cold air rushing in around her as she looked at the package in her hands. There was no return address, nothing to indicate where it had come from or why it had arrived. Just the plain wrapping, unmarked and simple. It was the kind of thing that might have been dismissed by anyone else, but Amara knew better. The weight of the package was strange, its edges sharp, and it felt somehow familiar. She had the sense that it was tied to something much larger than a mere delivery. The feeling from before, the one that had gnawed at her in the quiet of the cafe, pressed on her now. She closed the door behind her and turned the package over in her hands, her fingers brushing the surface of the paper. It was rough and aged, like something that had been left to weather the elements for years. There was something old about it, something that didn't quite belong in the modern world. Slowly, she peeled away the paper, revealing a wooden box, dark and worn with age. It was intricately carved, the surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change with the light. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she traced the carvings. There was a familiarity to them, but the details were lost on her, a connection just out of reach. She had seen something like this before. She was certain of it. But where? The box felt heavy in her hands as she ran her fingers along the edges, searching for any sign of a latch or a keyhole. There was none. The wood was smooth and seamless, the carvings beautiful in their complexity, yet there was no way to open it. She turned the box over in her hands, frustration starting to creep in. It was as if it were designed to remain closed, to remain a mystery. But then, she noticed something, a faint marking along one side, almost invisible against the dark wood. It was a small symbol, delicate and precise. It was the same symbol she had seen in her uncle's journal, a pattern that had caught her attention before but never quite made sense. The symbol had appeared on several of the journal's pages, always in the background, as if it held some deeper meaning. Her heart quickened as she realized the significance of the box. This was no ordinary package. It was a message, a clue that had arrived just when she needed it most. She could feel it in the air. The same tension that had been growing in the cafe, the same energy that had been building since she first arrived in Maple Ridge. The town was waiting, the cafe was waiting, and now the box had come to her, carrying with it something more than just a gift. There was no time to waste. She needed to open it, to understand what it meant. The hours stretched before her as she searched for a way to unlock the box. She tried everything she could think of, tapping it, shaking it, running her hands over the surface, but nothing seemed to work. It wasn't until the light began to fade, the late afternoon casting long shadows across the cafe floor, that she finally found the key, literally. The key was hidden in plain sight, tucked beneath the edge of the wooden box. It was small, made of brass, and looked as though it had been waiting there for decades. The design matched the symbol on the box perfectly. With trembling hands, Amara inserted the key into the small lock on the side of the box. The sound of the mechanism releasing was like a breath held for too long, and as the lid opened, a soft, golden light spilled out, filling the room with a warmth that felt almost unnatural in the chill of the evening. Inside, nestled carefully against layers of soft velvet, was a small, delicate object, a glass snowflake, intricate and beautiful, catching the light like 1,000 tiny crystals. Its edges were sharp and precise, its shape perfect, as though it had been crafted by hands that understood the language of winter. Amara's fingers hovered above it, awe and wonder filling her chest as she gently lifted it from its resting place. The snowflake felt cool and weightless in her hands, a symbol of something ancient and precious. As she held it, The quiet of the cafe seemed to deepen, and for the first time, she understood the significance of the box and its contents. The snowflake was a message, a symbol of the past, of the connections that had once bound the people of Maple Ridge together. It was a reminder that everything, the cafe, the town, her uncle's legacy, was tied together in ways that were not always visible. The box had been sent to her, not just as an object, but as a key to understanding the deeper mysteries of the town and of herself. The storm outside had intensified, but Amara was no longer aware of the cold, nor the passage of time. In that moment, as she gazed at the snowflake, she felt the weight of the world shift. Something was coming, something that would change everything, and she was ready to face it. Chapter 12. The Shimmering Star. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to enshroud the world in an eternal blanket of white. It covered everything: the roofs of houses, the streets, the branches of the towering trees, all transformed into a seamless stretch of white, silent beauty. Maple Ridge had become a world of muted colors: gray skies, white snow, the soft glow of lanterns. The town seemed to disappear beneath the weight of winter, leaving only shadows and echoes behind. Inside the North Pole Café, Amara could feel the shift in the air as the days drew nearer to Christmas. It wasn't just the season's festive preparations or the lights that adorned the cafe, though they certainly added to the ambience. No, there was something deeper, an undercurrent of change that tugged at her, a feeling that had taken root in her bones since the arrival of the mysterious box and its delicate glass snowflake. In the days that followed the discovery of the snowflake, Amara found herself returning to the box, tracing the carvings and the symbol that had guided her to its hidden key. She had placed the snowflake in the center of the cafe, where it rested on a pedestal by the hearth. Its fragile, crystalline edges glistened in the firelight, casting fleeting shadows across the room. Each time she looked at it, she felt the weight of the past pressing down upon her, as though the glass snowflake was not just a relic of the past but a bridge to a future she had yet to fully understand. The town, too, seemed to feel the shift. People had begun to gather more often at the cafe, some for the warmth of its fire, others for the comfort of its quiet hospitality. There was a subtle sense of anticipation in the air, a shared understanding that something was coming, something more than the festivities and the holiday cheer. Amara could see it in their eyes when they looked at her. There was a question there, unspoken but always present, like a heavy fog lingering on the horizon. What was she going to do next? What would she do with the legacy her uncle had left behind? She could no longer ignore the pull of the town's history, nor could she deny the sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on her heart. The cafe was hers now, but it was more than just a building. It was a memory, a connection to a time long gone, a place that had witnessed generations of lives come and go. The snowflake, delicate and fragile, symbolized the very essence of that history. It was a reminder that everything, even the smallest things, were interconnected. It was on a particularly cold morning, as Amara stood at the window gazing out into the swirling snow, that she felt the first true stirrings of understanding. The silence of the town was absolute, and the sound of the wind howling outside was the only noise that seemed to exist in the world. She watched the snowflakes dance in the wind, their graceful descent marking the passage of time, each one unique, yet part of a greater whole. In that moment, she realized that everything around her, the town, the cafe, the people, was like those snowflakes, separate and distinct, yet part of a greater design that could not be fully understood until all the pieces had fallen into place. The realization came slowly, as if the town itself had been whispering to her, drawing her deeper into its mysteries. The cafe had always been more than a place to rest. It was a place to reflect, to pause, to uncover the layers of history that had been buried beneath time and snow. Her uncle's journal, the chest, the key, all of it had led her here, to this moment of quiet understanding. She had thought that the snowflake was merely a symbol of the past, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a key to the future. The snowflake was a representation of everything that had come before her, but it was also a guide to what would come next. It was not just about uncovering the past, as she had once thought. It was about moving forward, about embracing the unknown and stepping into the future with an open heart. The cafe had become her home in ways she had never expected, and now it was time to take up the mantle of responsibility. She could no longer merely be an observer. She had to become a part of the story, just as the town and its people had become a part of hers. Amara moved away from the window, her gaze lingering on the snowflakes outside, now swirling in the wind like a dance of memories. There was no going back, no escaping the pull of the cafe and the legacy that had been entrusted to her. She had been given a gift wrapped in the mystery of the town, in the fragile beauty of the snowflake, and in the quiet strength of the cafe itself. As the days passed, she began to understand the next steps more clearly. The town had a rhythm to it, an undercurrent of traditions that had been passed down from generation to generation. There was a certain magic in the air, something that could not be fully explained but was felt by everyone who lived here. The cafe had once been the heart of Maple Ridge, a place where memories were made, where stories were shared, and where the town's history was written, one cup of coffee at a time. It was time to bring that magic back. Amara's thoughts turned to the people of the town, their faces, their stories, their quiet lives. She had come to know them over the weeks, and though the cafe had brought them together, she could not shake the feeling that there was still something they needed, something they were waiting for. The snowflake, though beautiful and delicate, was not the only key to unlocking the cafe's potential. The town itself, with all its traditions and memories, held the true key to its future. That night, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled up against the windows, Amara sat in the cafe, the fire crackling softly beside her. She had decided that it was time to open the doors to the town's history, to invite the people of Maple Ridge to be a part of the story once again. She would host a gathering, a celebration of the town's past and future, a night where the warmth of the cafe could bring everyone together, where the magic of the season could be shared. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, outside the windows of the cafe. But inside, there was warmth. A warmth that was not just the result of the fire, but of something deeper, something that Amara now understood. The North Pole Café was not just a place. It was a gathering point for all the stories that had shaped Maple Ridge and all the stories yet to be written. As she gazed at the snowflake resting delicately on its pedestal, Amara felt a quiet determination stir within her. She was ready to unlock the full potential of the cafe, ready to embrace her role in the town's history, and ready to see what awaited her in the future. The quiet before the storm had passed. The snow had fallen, and now it was time for something new to begin. Chapter 13. Hearts Carved in Oak. The days that followed the decision to host a gathering for the people of Maple Ridge passed in a blur of preparation. The cafe, once quiet and serene, became a flurry of activity. Amara, usually content to let the cafe run on its own rhythm, now found herself at the heart of the whirlwind. There were decorations to arrange, a menu to curate, and most importantly, an atmosphere to craft. She wanted this event to be more than just a celebration. It was meant to be a moment of connection, a way for the town to share in something greater than their individual lives. The first snowfall had settled, leaving the streets of Maple Ridge covered in a thick blanket of snow, untouched except for the occasional set of footprints. The town had been transformed. The familiar landmarks, the old church, the small bookshop on Main Street, the library with its ivy-clad walls, now stood as quiet sentinels, draped in their winter coats. The once vibrant colors of autumn had faded into the soft grays and whites of winter, but there was a quiet beauty in that transition. Everything felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from beneath the snow. Amara worked tirelessly in the cafe, determined to make it the kind of place that could bring the town together. She strung strands of evergreen garland along the walls, the fresh scent of pine filling the air as she worked. Gold and silver ornaments shimmered from the garland, catching the flickering light from the candles and the crackling fire in the hearth. She hung handmade wreaths on the windows and covered the tables with crisp white cloths, each one dotted with a single candle. The cafe was transformed into a winter wonderland, as though the very heart of the holiday season had taken root inside the old building. She spent hours making arrangements in the kitchen, preparing the perfect selection of comfort foods. There were rich stews simmering, the aroma of fresh-baked bread rising from the oven, and trays of spiced pastries dusted with sugar. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, the kind of scents that made you feel warm and safe, like being wrapped in a soft blanket by the fire. Amara knew that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way to nurture the soul, to create memories, to build bridges between people. Despite the flurry of activity, there was a quiet undercurrent to her movements. She was aware of the weight of the task she had taken on. This event was not just a holiday gathering. It was a reckoning. The town of Maple Ridge had seen its share of hardship, its share of loss, and now it was time to heal, to come together and rediscover the bonds that had once tied the community together. The cafe had once been the center of that community, and now, with her at its helm, it was time to bring that magic back. As the night of the gathering drew closer, Amara found herself standing in the cafe after hours, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the room. She was alone, save for the soft crackling of the fire. The cafe looked as though it had stepped out of a storybook, a place where time itself had slowed, where the outside world was held at bay by the warmth of the hearth and the glow of candles. She moved to the pedestal where the glass snowflake rested, its delicate edges catching the light in 1,000 tiny reflections. She had not been able to stop thinking about the snowflake, or what it represented. The more she considered it, the more she understood that it was not just a symbol of the town's past, but of its future as well. It was fragile, beautiful, and easily broken, yet it had endured. It had survived through the years, through the storms and the quiet moments, just as the town itself had. Amara's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, she thought it was merely the wind, the sound carried by the swirling storm outside. But then it came again, a solid, deliberate knock. She crossed the room, her heart racing slightly. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, the figure standing outside was familiar. Colin. His face was hidden behind the hood of his thick winter coat, but his eyes met hers as he stepped into the warmth of the cafe. The wind outside howled, but in the shelter of the cafe, there was only a quiet peace. He was carrying something in his hands, wrapped in burlap, his expression unreadable as he stepped inside. Amara didn't ask what brought him here, nor did he offer an explanation. There was no need for words, not in this moment. He walked silently to the counter, setting the bundle down with care. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a large, rough-hewn wooden carving, a star. Its edges were jagged, as though it had been hewn from the earth itself, yet it was undeniably beautiful in its simplicity. The craftsmanship was impeccable, the marks of the carver's hands visible in the texture of the wood. "This is for the gathering," Colin said, his voice low, though he had not yet spoken until now. For the center of the room, Amara looked at the carving, her fingers brushing lightly against the rough surface. The star was not just a decoration. It was a symbol, a focal point for the night ahead. It represented light in the darkness, hope amid uncertainty. It was the perfect symbol for a town that had weathered so much, a town that had learned how to survive, how to find strength in unity. Colin nodded as if sensing her thoughts. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the carving behind with a quiet assurance that Amara would know what to do with it. As he stepped back into the storm, the door closed behind him with a soft click, and the cafe was once again silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Amara stood for a moment, her fingers lingering on the edges of the star. She could feel the weight of the symbol in her hands, a promise of something more. She placed the star gently on the mantelpiece above the hearth, where it would catch the light of the fire, its edges glowing softly in the warmth of the flames. It would be the focal point of the gathering, the heart of the evening's celebration. The evening arrived sooner than expected, the dark sky hanging heavy with the promise of snow. The first guests trickled in, their faces flushed from the cold, their breath visible in the frosty air. The cafe filled slowly at first, but as the night deepened, the warm glow of the fire and the soft hum of the atmosphere began to draw more and more people in. The once quiet town was alive again, filled with laughter and the soft murmur of conversation. There was a sense of magic in the air, as though the town was rediscovering something it had lost long ago. Amara moved among the people, her heart light as she watched the connections form. The star above the hearth cast its warm light over the room, and the snowflake, delicately placed in the center, seemed to shimmer in the firelight, its crystal edges catching the reflections of the people who gathered around it. She could feel the pulse of the cafe, the warmth that had once been shared by so many, now radiating once more. The gathering was a success, a quiet triumph that would echo in the hearts of the townspeople for years to come. The cafe had once again become the heart of the town, a place where the past and future could coexist, where the bonds of community could be reforged in the warmth of the fire and the shared joy of the season. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was light. There was warmth. There was hope. Chapter 14. The Winter Waltz. The quiet that followed the gathering lingered like a soft echo, a serene afterglow that enveloped Maple Ridge and the North Pole Café. The event had been everything Amara had hoped for, perhaps more. People had come together, not just to celebrate the season, but to rediscover the connection that had always bound them as a community. The town, once distant and fractured, seemed to hum with a new energy. The cold winter air outside was still, but within the walls of the cafe, warmth radiated in the way people spoke, in the way they looked at one another, and in the way they gathered in the small, intimate corners of the room. Even the snow outside seemed to pause in its fall, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath, holding it just a moment longer. Amara often found herself walking through the cafe, watching as the townsfolk lingered over their coffee and pastries, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Each day that passed felt like another layer of history being added to the cafe, and with each new memory, she felt herself becoming more entwined with the place and the people around her. The cafe had become her anchor, and the town, once a collection of unfamiliar faces, had become home. Despite the joy and the warmth, there was a subtle shift that Amara could not ignore. The star that had been placed above the mantelpiece remained a central part of the room, a constant reminder of the unity that had been forged that night. But with that unity, there had come a new awareness of the changes that were yet to unfold. Something was stirring beneath the surface, a change that was as inevitable as the seasons. It had always been there, in the quiet corners of the cafe and in the hearts of the townspeople, but now it felt closer, as though it was waiting just outside the door, ready to step inside and settle. Amara stood one morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the cafe's windows, gazing out at the snow-covered streets. There was an unusual stillness to the morning. The wind had calmed, and the usual sounds of life in the town seemed muted, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The cafe was empty, save for the soft rustling of the fire in the hearth and the distant sound of the wind sighing against the walls. The world outside was blanketed in white, its contours softened by the falling snow. Her thoughts drifted to the snowflake, still resting on its pedestal by the fire. It had become a symbol in her mind, more than just an ornament or relic of the past. It was a constant reminder that everything in the world, every person, every moment, every story, was fragile and fleeting. Yet, like the snowflake itself, there was beauty in that fragility. It was a reminder that nothing was ever permanent, but that impermanence itself held its own kind of magic. She had been carrying that thought with her for weeks now, and yet, it still felt as though she was only beginning to understand its depth. Amara had often thought about what she would do with the cafe once the holiday season had passed. There had been a sense of urgency in her desire to make the gathering a success, as though the very act of gathering the town together would somehow make everything right. But now that the gathering was over, and the people of Maple Ridge had begun to return to their usual routines, she felt a shift in her understanding. The cafe was no longer just a place of comfort. It had become a symbol, a repository of all the town's memories and hopes. It was a living entity in itself, woven from the fabric of the town and its history. The town, too, seemed to be reflecting that shift. Each day, more and more people stopped by the cafe, not for coffee alone, but for connection. There were quiet conversations, shared glances, moments of understanding that passed between people who had once been strangers. It was as though the cafe had opened up a new space for the town, a space where they could rediscover each other and, in doing so, rediscover themselves. But the change was not without its complications. Not all the townspeople embraced the newfound sense of unity. There were still those who remained skeptical, those who felt that the past was a thing to be left behind, not something to be celebrated. There were murmurs in the corners of the room, and sideways glances exchanged over coffee. Amara could feel it, a subtle tension, like the air before a storm. For all the joy and warmth that had come with the gathering, there was an undercurrent of resistance to the change that had begun to take root. She had seen it in the way certain faces had turned away from the cafe's bright lights, retreating into the shadows of their homes, unwilling to join in the spirit of the season. There were stories buried deep within the town's history, stories that were not easily told or heard. People carried their burdens silently, and the weight of those burdens had not disappeared just because of one gathering. The scars of time, of loss and betrayal, were not easily erased. It was in these moments that Amara found herself questioning her place in all of this. Was she truly ready to take on the responsibility of the cafe, to carry its legacy forward? She had spent so many years running from her own past, from the expectations placed upon her, that the weight of the town's history felt heavy on her shoulders. She had come here to escape, to find a life that was free from the pressure of being something she wasn't. But now, the cafe was calling her to be more than just a caretaker. It was calling her to be a part of something larger, something that demanded more from her than she had ever been prepared to give. The days grew shorter as the end of the year approached, and with each passing day, the storm outside seemed to grow more fierce. The snow fell in thicker drifts, and the winds howled through the streets. It was as though the world was bracing for something, preparing itself for the unknown that was just beyond the horizon. The town, too, seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for the moment when the changes that had begun would finally come to a head. Amara found herself standing by the window late one evening, watching the snowflakes drift past in the swirling wind. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of voices in the background, the flickering of the firelight casting long shadows across the room. The star above the hearth seemed to glow brighter than ever, its edges sharp and clear against the warmth of the fire. She had always believed that things in life happened for a reason, that every twist and turn was part of a greater plan, a pattern waiting to be revealed. But now, standing there in the quiet of the cafe, she began to wonder if she had been wrong. Perhaps there were no answers to be found in the patterns of the past. Perhaps the key to the future lay in accepting the chaos, in embracing the uncertainty of what was to come. And yet, as the snow continued to fall outside, she could not help but feel that the cafe, like the snowflakes that drifted past the window, was part of something much greater. It was a place of connection, a place where the past and the future could meet, if only for a moment. It was fragile, beautiful, and full of possibility. The winds of change were indeed blowing through Maple Ridge, but as Amara stood in the warmth of the cafe, she realized that the greatest challenge was not facing the storm. It was learning to embrace it. The cafe had become more than just a place to shelter from the storm. It had become a place to find the courage to face it together. Chapter 15. Candles on the Sill. The world outside the North Pole Café was increasingly unrecognizable as winter dug its heels deeper into the town of Maple Ridge. The snow that had once fallen softly in graceful flurries now arrived in heavy, relentless waves, blurring the edges of everything in sight. The streets had become narrow, winding paths, each covered by a thick, ever-growing blanket of white. The sharp, biting wind sliced through the air, sending icy tendrils into every corner of the town. Yet, despite the severity of the storm, there was something calm about the way the town seemed to withdraw into itself, as if waiting for the final chapter of winter to unfold. Inside the cafe, the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its warmth providing a sense of refuge from the howling storm outside. The once vibrant energy that had filled the space during the recent gathering had faded, but there was still a quiet hum of activity. The cafe had become a second home for many in the town, and its familiar comfort was something they clung to as the season deepened. The aroma of fresh-baked bread and spiced cider lingered in the air, offering a subtle reassurance that, for all the chaos outside, there was still warmth here, still a place to rest, still a place to heal. Amara found herself, once again, standing behind the counter, her hands moving absent-mindedly as she prepared another batch of dough. The rhythm of kneading and folding had become a form of meditation for her, a quiet way to center her thoughts. The cafe, now a regular part of her life, had become a puzzle she was still trying to solve. There were days when everything seemed to click, the conversations, the food, the ambience. But then there were other days when she felt more like a spectator than an active participant. The town's revival, its growth into something more cohesive, felt like it was moving in directions she had not anticipated, and sometimes it unsettled her. She had come to realize that, in her desire to find belonging, she had become a part of something larger than herself, something that demanded not just her presence, but her understanding. The cafe was not just hers, but the town's. It belonged to the people who came and went, who passed through its doors seeking something: comfort, escape, connection, whether they knew it or not. Each customer, each conversation, was a piece of the puzzle, and slowly, Amara was beginning to see how it all fit together. But there was something deeper, something she had yet to comprehend, lurking just beneath the surface. It was that awareness, that unspoken tension, which had become so palpable in the past few weeks. The town had begun to change, but there was a quiet resistance in the undercurrent of that change. Not everyone was eager to embrace what the cafe had become: a place of gathering, of open-hearted conversation, of connection. There were whispers in the corners of the cafe, small murmurs exchanged over cups of coffee, about the past and about the shifts taking place now. Some people had embraced the new spirit of community, but others resented it. They wanted the quiet of isolation, the comfort of things left undisturbed. And in those small moments, those fleeting glances, Amara sensed a disquiet that she hadn't before. The cafe had always been a place of refuge, a haven from the world outside. But now, it was more than just that. It had become a battleground, a place where the past and the future were colliding, where the present was fraught with a tension that could not be ignored. The town was torn between its history and the pull towards something new, something unknown. The very thing that had drawn Amara to this place, the promise of belonging, was now the source of a quiet unease. Yet, as she moved through the cafe, cleaning tables and preparing fresh batches of pastries, she couldn't ignore the way the atmosphere had shifted over the past few days. The energy in the room had become heavier, thicker, as though something was waiting just beneath the surface, ready to break free. The fire in the hearth was no longer just a source of warmth. It had become a constant companion, crackling and popping as though it, too, was restless. And then, as if to confirm her growing sense of unease, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the stillness of the room, its sharpness almost jarring against the steady rhythm of the cafe. Amara, who had been lost in her own thoughts, straightened up, her heart skipping a beat. The cafe had been quiet for the past hour, and the sudden interruption brought her mind back to the present. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the door, her steps slow, measured. When she opened it, the storm outside seemed to rush in, bringing with it the cold air and a rush of snowflakes. Standing there in the doorway was a figure, silhouetted against the backdrop of the swirling winter storm. It was Colin. He stepped inside, his coat heavy with the snow that clung to it, his boots leaving prints on the floor as he shook the cold from his body. His face was flushed from the cold, and his eyes held an unfamiliar intensity. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the storm that raged outside. Instead, he simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the fire, his presence filling the room with an undeniable weight. Amara stepped aside, allowing him to enter fully, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The space between them, once so comfortable and familiar, now felt charged, electric. There was a distance, a subtle shift that she couldn't quite place, yet it lingered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Colin moved toward the hearth, standing by the fire for a moment, as if he needed its warmth to thaw the chill that had settled into his bones. Amara watched him silently, her hands still resting on the counter. There was something about his stillness that unnerved her, something about the quiet weight he carried that she couldn't quite understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned toward her, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter in her chest. It wasn't just the cold that made the room feel frigid now. It was the unspoken words, the things left unaddressed, the tension that had been quietly building between them. Amara could feel it. The pull between them was undeniable, stronger than it had ever been before. But there was something else, something darker. Beneath that connection, she had always sensed it, that undercurrent of uncertainty, of things unsaid. And now, as she stood in the warmth of the cafe, watching Colin by the fire, she realized that whatever it was, it had come to the surface. The quiet hum of the cafe, the gentle crackling of the fire, the swirling snow outside. It all seemed to fade away as she stood there, caught in the moment, caught between the past and the future, caught between what was and what could be. Beneath the surface of the cafe, beneath the warmth of its walls, change was stirring, just as it was in the town itself. And with it, the winds of change had finally begun to blow. As the storm raged on outside, Amara knew that the decisions of the coming days would shape not just the future of the cafe, but the future of Maple Ridge. And she, more than anyone, would have to find a way to navigate the tides of change, no matter how turbulent the waters might become. Chapter 16. The Storm's Embrace. The winds of winter had reached their peak, and the town of Maple Ridge found itself buried beneath a thick layer of snow. The once familiar landscape had transformed into a dreamlike blur of white, with houses and trees obscured beneath the weight of the season. The town, now almost entirely encased in frost, seemed suspended in time. Days drifted by in a soft, muted haze, with only the distant rumble of snowplows and the occasional crunch of footsteps breaking the silence. In the heart of it all stood the North Pole Café, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Inside, the café hummed with life, its fire crackling steadily, and the familiar sounds of cups clinking and soft conversations drifting through the air. The warmth of the café felt like a sanctuary in the midst of the storm, and it was here that Amara spent her days, her hands often occupied with the comforting tasks of baking and cleaning, while her mind swirled with thoughts she could no longer ignore. The events of the past few weeks had left their mark on her. She had watched as the town had come together, united by the spirit of the season, only to sense that the peace they had found was fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The café, which had once been a neutral space, now felt like a crucible, where old wounds were being opened and new ones were being formed. And Colin, his sudden, unexplained distance had left a palpable void. Amara had felt the weight of it most keenly during the long stretches of time when he had disappeared into the storm, retreating into his work or the quiet solitude of his home. There were moments when she could almost see the shadow of the man he once was, the man she had connected with so easily, the one whose presence had filled the room with a kind of warmth. But now, that warmth felt elusive, like a fire that flickered out just as soon as it had begun to burn bright. The space between them had widened, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it. The café had become a silent battleground, where their unspoken words and unresolved feelings piled up like the snow outside. Amara moved through the café with a sense of quiet resolve. She had become adept at pushing her thoughts to the back of her mind, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. She greeted customers with a smile, prepared food with care, and ensured the fire remained stoked, its light casting a soft glow across the room. She had become a creature of habit, and it was the familiarity of the café, its comforting rhythm, that kept her grounded in the face of the mounting uncertainty. But despite the comfort of routine, Amara could feel herself becoming restless. It was as if the walls of the café were closing in around her, pressing against her chest, suffocating her in a way she hadn't expected. The very place she had come to love, the one that had given her a sense of belonging, was now the place where she felt the most trapped. It was as though the café had a life of its own, a quiet pulse that throbbed through the floorboards and walls. She had always sensed it. The café was more than just a building. It was a reflection of the town itself. And now, as the town struggled with its own growing pains, so too did the café. The warm, welcoming atmosphere she had worked so hard to create had become overlaid with a tension she couldn't ignore. The conversations, once filled with laughter and shared stories, had taken on a quieter tone, as if the people of Maple Ridge were holding their breath, unsure of what was to come. Amara had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused, to avoid getting swept up in the emotions that swirled around her. But now, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the weight of it all. Her thoughts returned, inevitably, to the uncertainty that had taken root in her heart. She had come to Maple Ridge to escape her past, to build a life on her own terms. But the town, the café, and most of all, Colin, had become a mirror for all the things she had tried to outrun. The past was never as far behind as she had hoped, and every decision she made seemed to pull her closer to it, rather than further away. It was in the quiet of one particular evening, as the café emptied and the fire burned low, that the weight of everything truly settled in her chest. The storm outside had not abated, and the snow continued to fall in thick, unyielding sheets. Amara stood alone in the cafe, the last of the customers having left for the night. The cafe was quiet now, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft hiss of the wind outside. She had cleaned the counters and straightened the chairs, and now she stood still, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, her eyes lost in the dance of the flames. In that moment, she understood something deep within herself. The cafe was more than just a business to her. It had become a part of her. She had invested so much of herself into this place, into the idea of what it could become, that it had become intertwined with her very sense of identity. To let go of it, to walk away, would feel like abandoning a piece of herself. But could she continue to carry it? Could she carry the weight of the past, the tension between what had been and what might be, without losing herself in the process? Her gaze shifted to the window, where the snow continued to fall in delicate, swirling patterns. The world outside seemed vast, endless, but here, in the warmth of the cafe, she felt small, confined. The town had become both a source of connection and a mirror for her own struggles. She could see the fractures in the town's spirit, the deep-rooted divisions that had yet to heal. And she could feel the fractures within herself as well. Places where she had yet to heal, places where her own wounds still bled. But even in the face of that uncertainty, Amara knew that she couldn't run from it. She had chosen this life, this town, this cafe. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she had to find the courage to move forward. There would always be forces pulling her in different directions, urging her to retreat, to abandon the very things that had brought her peace. But there was something in her now, something deep and unyielding, that told her to stay. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back. And as she stood there, alone in the cafe, with the storm raging outside, Amara made a silent promise to herself. She would face what was to come, no matter how difficult, no matter how uncertain. The ground beneath her might be shifting, but she would find her footing once again. The cafe, with all its warmth and tension, would be the place where she would confront not only the past, but the future as well. For Maple Ridge, and for herself, she would not run. She would stand firm as the snow continued to fall, and as the winds of change began to sweep across the town, ready to reshape everything they touched. Chapter 17. A New Year's Dawn. The snow had finally begun to thin, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in white silence. For days, the storm had held the town in its grasp, but now, as the first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, a sense of stillness settled over Maple Ridge. The streets, once filled with the furious rush of snowplows and bundled-up townsfolk, were now eerily quiet. The world had slowed, as if the storm had given everyone permission to breathe again. Amara stood by the window of the cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the delicate flakes drift lazily to the ground. The storm's fury had passed, but the remnants of its power were everywhere. In the drifts piled against the buildings, in the thick layer of ice clinging to the branches of trees, and in the quiet rhythm of the town as it recovered from its ordeal. The streets were still lined with snow, and the distant mountains stood shrouded in mist, their outlines barely visible. But something had changed in the air. The promise of a new day was palpable, and yet, beneath it, there was a tension, a quiet anticipation. The cafe, too, felt different. The fire had burned low, and the usual hum of conversation was absent. The stillness in the room was a reflection of the town itself, a moment of pause before the inevitable shifts that were coming. Amara could sense it. The cafe had been her anchor, her constant in the storm, but even here, she could feel the ground beginning to move beneath her feet. She had spent so many months trying to understand her place in this town, trying to find her rhythm in its cycles. But now, she was coming to realize that the town itself was on the cusp of something else. a change that neither she nor anyone else could avoid. It was in the way the town seemed to stir now, slowly but surely. The cafe had been a beacon of warmth and safety in the midst of winter's fiercest days. But now, as the snow cleared and the world began to thaw, the cafe's role seemed uncertain. The community, which had gathered here for comfort, was now beginning to look beyond these walls. There were plans whispered in the streets, possibilities that seemed to float just out of reach. What had once been a gathering place, a small sanctuary, was becoming something else, a symbol of what was and what might be. Amara turned from the window and walked slowly to the counter, where a fresh pot of coffee had been brewed. She poured herself a cup, letting the steam curl up toward her face, its warmth a small comfort. The cafe, though quieter than usual, still carried the traces of its former energy. The sweet scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked goods hung in the air, and the fire, though now reduced to embers, continued to give off a soft, persistent heat. But there was a heaviness now, a weight she could no longer ignore. The days had become a blur of preparations, cleaning, baking, and maintaining the space for whatever the future would hold. But even as she moved through the motions, she couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting for her. The cafe was her home, her safe haven. But now, as the seasons turned and the town began to change, she could feel the walls of that safety closing in around her. There was a restlessness in her chest that had been growing steadily, a longing for something beyond the daily rituals, something deeper and more profound. Outside, the streets had begun to clear as the storm's aftermath was addressed. Snowplows had made their way through the town, carving paths through the drifts, and people were starting to emerge from their homes, slowly but surely. The town felt reborn, washed clean by the storm, ready to face whatever was next. But for Amara, the question remained. What came next for her? The cafe had been the thread that tied her to Maple Ridge, but what if that thread was starting to unravel? In the midst of her thoughts, the door to the cafe opened, and a gust of cold air swept in. Amara looked up, startled, to see Colin standing in the doorway. His silhouette was framed by the frosty landscape outside, his face still flushed from the cold. He hesitated at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room, before stepping inside. The door closed softly behind him, sealing off the winter chill. The shift between them was undeniable. Amara could feel it in the way the space between them had grown, in the subtle tension that had settled like dust in the corners of the cafe. Colin's presence, once a comforting and familiar part of her days, now felt like an echo, distant, lingering, but not quite real. He moved toward the counter slowly, his boots making soft impressions on the wooden floor, and Amara watched him, her heart quiet and uncertain. He didn't speak as he approached. There was something about him, something different, though she couldn't quite place it. He was no longer the easygoing man who had worked tirelessly alongside her, his smile lighting up the room. Now, there was a heaviness in his shoulders, a weariness in the set of his jaw, and as he reached the counter, his gaze flicked to hers, but there was no spark in his eyes, no warmth to the glance, only a kind of quiet sadness that seemed to hang between them like a veil. Amara set her cup of coffee down, her hands trembling slightly. The silence between them stretched long, and for a moment, the cafe felt like the smallest place in the world, a tiny, closed-off bubble where the rest of the world was forgotten, where time seemed to stand still. The weight of their unspoken history hung heavily in the air, pressing down on both of them. Neither of them spoke, but the tension between them was almost tangible. It was as if the very act of acknowledging each other would break something fragile and irreplaceable. For a long while, Amara stood there, her mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts and emotions. She had wanted so badly to be a part of this town, to carve out a space for herself in Maple Ridge. But now, standing in the same room as Colin, she couldn't help but wonder if the space she had built for herself was no longer enough. The walls of the cafe, once a source of comfort, now seemed to close in around her, as if pressing her toward an inevitable decision. Could she continue to live in the in-between, caught between the past and the future, or would she have to let go of something, someone? If she wanted to move forward, it was then that she understood. The cafe was more than just a business, more than just a place to find solace. It was a reflection of the town itself, and the town, like her, was changing. The very foundation of her life in Maple Ridge had begun to shift, and the questions that had once seemed so clear now seemed almost impossible to answer. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the storm that had begun within her still raged. Chapter 18. The Evergreen Promise. The morning arrived with a softness that belied the gravity of the days that had passed. The snow that had once blanketed the world in an endless stretch of white had now begun to melt, leaving behind the traces of its presence in the form of swollen rivers and muddy streets. Maple Ridge, though still touched by winter's grasp, seemed to breathe easier now. The air, once biting and cold, now carried a hint of something different. The promise of spring, or perhaps simply the quiet acceptance that time was moving forward, regardless of how tightly the town held on to its memories. Inside the North Pole Café, Amara found herself once again alone with her thoughts. The cafe was empty in those early hours, the fire reduced to glowing embers and the tables left undisturbed from the night before. The usual hum of the place was absent, and it felt as though the entire town, the entire world, had paused for just a moment, holding its breath. Amara moved through the cafe with a quiet determination, cleaning and setting things in order. The routine of it, the familiar motions, gave her a sense of stability. But beneath that calm exterior, the restlessness that had taken root within her over the past weeks had only grown stronger. The tension she had felt, between herself and the cafe, between herself and Colin, had become more than just a presence. It was now a weight she carried, pressing down on her every step, shaping the way she moved through her days. The cafe, once a place of refuge, now seemed to pulse with the energy of the unknown. She could no longer ignore the changes that had overtaken her. The town, too, was shifting, moving toward a future that was unclear but undeniably close. It was as though the very foundations of everything she had built here, her life, her work, her connection to the town and to Colin, were being tested, and in that testing, she felt herself fraying at the edges, unable to grasp onto anything solid. The sun, weak but persistent, cast a pale light through the windows, its rays catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Amara paused by the counter, her hands resting on the smooth wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers. She had come to think of this place as home, but now, as the days stretched on, it felt more like a crossroads, where the past and the future collided, where every choice felt heavy with consequence. She had spent so much of her time in Maple Ridge trying to make peace with the life she had chosen. She had embraced the quiet simplicity of the town, the comfort of routine, and the promise of a new beginning. But now, as the days passed and the snow melted away, she couldn't help but feel that she was standing at the edge of something. Something that could either carry her forward or leave her standing still, caught in the spaces between. Her gaze drifted to the door, half expecting to see Colin's familiar figure appear in the doorway. But the room remained still, untouched. There was a tension in the air, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. The absence of his presence, though familiar by now, felt like a glaring void. In the months that had passed since he had distanced himself, the space between them had only grown wider. And yet, even in his absence, there was a quiet understanding between them, an acknowledgement that something was changing. But what that something was, neither of them could say. She had tried to ignore the pull toward him, to bury the feelings that had once been so clear and easy to understand. But now, as the days wore on and the town began to shake off the grip of winter, those feelings had returned with a force she could no longer deny. The question remained, however, was it too late? Had the space between them become too vast to bridge? The cafe had been a place of hope and renewal for her, but now it seemed to be a mirror for everything she couldn't change. The connection she had felt with Colin, the warmth they had shared, now seemed like a distant memory, fading in the face of the uncertainty that gripped her. Outside, the streets were beginning to thaw, the ice breaking free from the sidewalks as the first signs of spring began to show. But within the walls of the cafe, time felt frozen. The world outside had moved on, and yet, here she stood, holding onto the fragments of a past she couldn't quite let go of. It was then that the door opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty cafe. Amara looked up, her heart quickening at the sight of Colin standing in the doorway. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the weight of everything that had passed between them seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was no longer oppressive. Instead, it was filled with the weight of everything that had been unsaid, everything that had been left to linger in the space between them. Colin stepped inside, his presence as familiar as the cafe itself. But there was something different in the way he moved, something less certain. He walked toward the counter slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a quietness in his demeanor, a kind of restraint that Amara hadn't seen before. It was as if he, too, felt the gravity of this moment, the sense that something was about to change. Amara's heart beat faster, but she stood still, waiting. She had no words to offer, no explanations or questions to ask. The space between them was vast, and yet, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid. It was as though the silence between them was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. In that stillness, they both understood that the future was waiting, just beyond their reach, and the time to make a choice was now. The cafe, which had once been a symbol of her refuge, now stood as a symbol of the crossroads she faced. It was no longer just a place. It was a reminder of the past, a thread that had bound her to Maple Ridge, to the life she had created here. But it was also a mirror, reflecting the choices she had yet to make, the paths she had yet to walk. The snow had melted, the world was shifting, and Amara knew that the time had come. Whatever came next, whatever change awaited, she could no longer hold back. The cafe, the town, and even her heart, all were in motion. And though the future was still uncertain, she was ready to step forward. For better or worse, the weight of tomorrow was finally here.